being here. As we've seen, a good part of our work in this cost action has been devoted to devising this metadata survey registry. So it's very important for us to have feedback from potential users, and not only users, because some of you have also been contributors to the registry. And we're interested in all that you can share with us regarding how this can fill in data knowledge gaps, but also to any, we're interested in finding out any comment that you might have, not only regarding the registry, but any of the goals that were detailed by Laurent in her presentation. So the 3 organizations that you work in, or institutions, advocate evidence-based policies, and ultimately this aims to contribute to that. So before you start, let me introduce the audience, the participants, and thanks for being here. We have starting from the the left. Sorry, I'm a bit confused always with left and right. Laurent, Aujean, from Director General regarding migration and home affairs. Then Thomas Huddleston from Migration Policy Group, and finally Aliyyah, sorry, from Migration Policy Institute Europe. So maybe you have 8 to 10 minutes each to tell us. It'd be interesting to know a bit of what you do and how we can help to achieving those goals. So yeah, we will do 8 to 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a common question and comments to the whole session. Thanks again for being here.
Okay.
Well,
Hello everyone. So Laurent from the European Commission Home Affairs Unit. I'll start so that my colleagues on the right can perhaps criticize or enlarge the discussion afterwards. No, I don't expect this meeting to be particularly provocative or difficult. No, what I wanted to highlight is that indeed we're aiming at having evidence-based policy, and it's good to have such a project. We tried to follow with it, and also to have also some dissemination of some of the results and methodology inside the Commission already. Last year, Laura and your colleague came to have a presentation to various directorates in the Commission, because obviously the topics that are covered by the survey, they also make a lot of sense for equality data, anti-discrimination, education, other policy areas. I think often there is a large distance between such a project outcomes and policy makers or decision makers that claim or want to have evidence-based policies. And so there will be still some need for further dissemination of the results to make sure that, for instance, national or regional authorities that work on inclusion or integration or other aspects are well aware of what they can really gain from it. First, I mean, the obvious example is if they want to launch themselves a survey on a specific group, to really not reinvent the wheel, start with what exists, try to find the questionnaire. Also, the post-harmonization phase will be very interesting in our view, because often, as you know, what decision makers are looking at are, okay, what do we know from the surveys, and not, you know, what are the questions or what are the methodology behind. So that they will look automatically to what we can gain in terms of knowledge. For sure, I already started also looking at the registry, for instance, to look what they were specifically on refugees, for instance, because it's an obvious group of interest over the last few years. I saw most of them were in Turkey, which also tells a lot, and that we would tend, for instance, to neglect all the efforts that were made in that country, not only to host refugees, but also to better understand their needs. And it was quite interesting that it was in Germany, without surprise, but also in Turkey. Just to say what we do at the Commission level on integration indicators and data is perhaps first to have better availability of data based on EU-wide survey mostly. And so this project clearly complements what we also already trying to do with Eurostat, with the FRA, with other data producers in a way, because it's true that generally we focus on, let's say, having those data available, also having them analyzed. So we have this collaboration with OECD, with this settling in report on integration indicators, now every 3 years, where it's true that we don't do so much in this report post-harmonization. We mostly use what we have, especially the EU Labour Force Survey and EU Silk, as well as OECD, PISA, PIAC survey, etc. And on that I would like to mention, I mean I take advantage of this conference to mention that even if the EU Labour Force Survey, that most of you may know, have big limitations when it comes to the sample size and the representativeness of migrants, or let's say second generation, if we call them like that, in this survey, still there is a huge advantage of using such data source because of the quality, the fact that, as you know, the concepts are very clearly defined, ILO definition of employment and all of that, and also because then you can cross with many other variables that are asked in such a survey. What I wanted to highlight is the big improvement we'll have in the future, which will be that instead of having some key variables only asked in these modules every 6-7 years, the reason for migration, self-declared reason for migration, as well as the country of birth of the parents, will be asked every 2 years for the former and every year for the later variable, as well as the education of parents. So we will gain a lot of, let's say, more power in using such a survey to better analyze the situation of migrants and their descendants. We will not have such situation in another survey which is called EU Silk, despite it's quite key to measure indeed living conditions, poverty, housing, and plenty of other key components of daily life of migrants and minorities. One key obstacle will remain also the sample size, especially in this EU Silk survey. So we'll still have a lot to do. So this was about the data. Now, what I would like to suggest for the future is perhaps 2 things. One is that in the post-harmonization phase, you indeed manage to set some priorities. If you see that you have 900 surveys in the registry, or you will have 900 surveys, and it's so huge that indeed you will need to focus. Perhaps it would be interesting to, on our side, that you also focus so not only on the hard indicators such as employment rate or poverty situation, etc., but also on, if you like, softer dimension, even if they are not so soft because I include in them discrimination. But what I mean is that indeed at EU level we tend to have quite good EU indicators on those that are surveyed in those typical household survey at EU level, but we have less on indeed perceptions, sense of belongings, as well as active participation or discrimination. And another topic which is rather not a topic but a target group may be interesting to check for refugees. We have seen some good data efforts in some EU member states, well typically Germany, Austria, the Nordic countries. Now a lot do that through administrative data, so you have to check also what is available in surveys versus more in administrative type of data. And then my second proposal was that we organize a presentation of EU cost action, this cost action when it's finalized, to all EU member states, I mean to our European integration network, who last year devoted a specific day to data and indicators and evaluations. Both Migration Policy Group and MPI kindly came also to present what we can do at EU level to make some progress on that. We intend to have more work on data and indicators, perhaps to have a subgroup of this representative of EU ministries dealing with integration, specifically devoted to data. In the past, they adopted these EU Saragossa indicators, so it's to be seen how they can go beyond that, how they can learn from fundamental rights agency surveys, how they can learn from future MIPEX, or this specific project you have on refugees, integration policies, as well as from the cost action. Where we are going is also more in the local and regional dimension, so subnational. May be interesting to check what the cost action can offer there. But let's indeed not forget the cost aspect, and the cost in the sense that most national statistical institutes are under pressure. Eurostat is suggesting them to move rather in the directions of administrative data, hoping that in 10 years' time you can click on a button and have all the outcomes of the population, whatever their country of birth, their sex, age, and social situation, as well as where they live in the country. So it may be feasible for some member states, much more difficult for others. But so tomorrow Belgium will present their national monitoring of socio-economic outcomes of first, second, third generations. And this is a very good example in EU, how you can build on administrative data source across them to make sure that also the huge cost that you put into server data may also be invested into better administrative data source and cost. I hope I was not too long, and thanks very much for the work which is done.
Okay. So yeah, I could add just a little bit from the work that Migration Policy Group tries to do to compare research, but also to generate new research and use. I know that the data registry will be useful because I used something quite similar. I think it was Promenstat back in the day when we were designing the Immigrant Citizens Survey. So it's quite necessary, I think, that before we take a step to do comparative or European-wide surveys, that we look at existing national questions and find the best formulations. As Laurent also pointed out, well, what you're able to do over the next year will partly determine how useful the results will be. So let me just start from what I hope we can already use from the existing results, and probably what's most feasible in the next steps. So I think already, if you can come to the step of identifying key survey questions, and by doing this review of the wording of these questions, coming up with some recommendations of the proper way that these questions should be worded, that would be a huge step forward already, because as Laurent also noted, there's much greater appetite in European level surveys for inclusion of migrants and ethnic minorities, but we don't necessarily have the kind of community of practice reflecting on the proper wording on this. I know that you are doing this through the European Social Survey, which is very important and still probably one of the better sources. But as Laurent was noting, there will be the ad hoc module that's already, I think the questionnaire is already finalized, but there will be future ad hoc modules. And Lila Farkas, who's in the audience, one of my colleagues from MPG, was particularly looking at how different European surveys can be used for monitoring ethnicity and also race. And I think that there's a huge potential here, but we need to know actually what questions we should be pushing for. Also from research from the Commission side and from civil society. So identifying key questions that would allow us to monitor migration, but also ethnicity and race, would be useful because we often have very kind of quick and non-transparent processes for deciding these questions. A few of you might have participated in the Fundamental Rights Agency's consultations on the design of the EU Midas survey, which in this last round opened up to integration, but involved some questions that, were not ideally worded, and I think the usability will be limited. This is an experience I can also share from the design of the Immigrant Citizens Survey, right? So I think that already if you can identify reliable, good wordings of survey questions, we can then pick that up for future dissemination in future surveys. If you're able to go to a step of some post-harmonization, I completely agree with Laurent's recommendations. I think it would be useful to maybe choose one or two hard questions that can give us a little bit of a benchmark for comparing what your harmonization produced compared to other comparable surveys, but I think then you should go in and focus on, as what Laurent said, areas that are not well covered from EU Midas, from the LFS, and from Silk. And I also would recommend that any harmonization on the local level would also be useful, at least for one or two questions, to then perhaps propose additional harmonization work. And I think you need to start building up perhaps a project for this post-harmonization work. Because beyond that, I don't see yet enough chances for usability. If I remember from previous discussions, you will have the questions and you will have links to the data, but most of the data was not publicly available, if I remember correctly, right? So this limits the usefulness for policy or for researchers or for civil society who often do not know of the results of these migration or ethnic survey results. So there the usability will be slightly limited. And I wanted to make one last conceptual point, which is this project links together migrants and ethnic minorities. And I think conceptually it would also be quite useful if there's some reflection on how we can better link together our work on migrant integration with ethnic equality data monitoring. Because from the work that Migration Policy Group was doing with DG Justice on equality data indicators, we saw that actually most of the work that's being done across Europe on collecting ethnic equality data is actually the proxies that we use for measuring migrant integration. But proxies are regularly used in equality data collection, so this is not something new. However, it means that actually these two things are done in silos, and it's quite common that among policymakers on integration, they are now aware of migrant integration indicators, and they're using this type of data, but then they say that we can't actually do anything to monitor ethnic equality data. And we cannot compare migrant integration to equality data on other grounds, which I find is highly problematic because it continues us in the silo thinking that migrant integration is something completely different from work on equality, and that we need different measures for integration rather than measures on equality, when actually many of the EU policy areas that could have the greatest impact on integration are mainstream policy areas and long-term inclusion measures. And I know that in the current Commission there is discussion about how the new integration action plan can also look at equality, so that we're not, again, talking about specific measures for migrants, but looking at how our work on migrant integration can also support LGBTI equality, disability, and so on. And so I think it would be quite interesting, maybe this is in your survey questions, or maybe it's a different output, but to really link up the surveys that you have on migrant integration and explain how this can be used more for ethnic equality data monitoring.
Okay, thanks. I won't bother repeating all the great points that were just made in the two speakers ahead of me. I can just say, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Migration Policy Institute, that it's an independent think tank here in Brussels that looks at migration policy, but also integration and asylum and refugee policy. I'm very happy to be here. I think this is very exciting work that you're doing, and it comes at a really important time. what I've witnessed, at least over the past few years, has been really a sea change in policymakers towards data gathering and also more specifically monitoring and evaluation. And so that's both to just to track whether objectives are being met, but also being used more in communications. So what kind of data can be gathered that will tell success stories, both to decision makers, but also to the public. And it's also important, as Thomas mentioned, with the European Commission looking into this new integration action plan and strategy of what's really important. And as Laurent mentioned, not just these hard indicators, but also the things that when you speak to people on the ground, what really matters to them when describing what integration and inclusion are. So I just wanted to mention a couple of additional points based on some of the work that I've been doing at MPI. We are one of the members of EU Frank. If you're not familiar, it's a project on refugee resettlement that's led by the Swedish Migration Agency. And anyway, we've been working with 3 countries on developing a monitoring and evaluation pilot project. So that's Italy, Ireland, and the Netherlands. And this, I think, has revealed a few lessons that might be helpful here. And one of which is that it doesn't matter how much data we have if we don't know what our objectives are. And I think a lot of migration policies and refugee and particularly resettlement policies in recent years have been developed so quickly that there hasn't really been time to step back and think, well, what are the objectives of these policies? So that's what we've been doing, developing logic frames, objectives, and indicators. And I think this tool that you're creating here will be really useful to help policymakers create a baseline of data that they can then use for their subsequent measures. And also it will inform the data tools that they're creating. So as Thomas was mentioning, refining questions that will be on surveys or house visit tools that they're using as well. And also, a third point, just to connect policymakers with researchers, because I saw that in the database it has an email address, I think, for the person who did the survey. So that's going to be an extremely useful tool. And this will help as well just to plug these gaps that were mentioned already, specifically in ethnicity data, which I know in many countries in Europe is still quite taboo to collect at the national level or the local level, or from the public authorities' perspective. And that, I think, will also help to sort of broaden this two-way street that we often talk about in integration, but it ends up really only looking at what the migrants or people with migrant backgrounds are doing and their attitudes and behaviors and outcomes. But we can really use this survey data to look at the other side of what's happening in society more broadly. And the second point, just that I think this will be really helpful from a policy perspective, is identifying different target populations. And so Laurent also pulled out refugees, and I'd like to make that even more specific, if I can, to resettled refugees or spontaneous arrivals, and really being able to break down by the route of entry or by the type of legal status. Because I know some policymakers are just having to sort of guess and use proxies like, well, Chechens in Austria may most likely be refugees, but that's not the best way of doing this. And so that just brings me to a broader point, I think, about the importance of the keywords function on this tool in general. EMM, if that's a well-known acronym, I don't think it's well used in policy spheres as far as I'm aware. Also one point on UK versus US spelling. I know that's very pedantic. But yeah, so if there could be more differentiation on things like sponsorship, on resettlement, being able to dig into those tools. I didn't find anything just when I was searching. And also just things like in the simple filter function, there's the target population with terms standardized. And I saw that when you look for Muslim, it gives you a different thing than when you look for Muslims. So those things will be really important to try and catch, just to make this as useful as possible.
So thank you for very, very useful comments and suggestions from the very, very detailed one that you just gave us, because it obviously, as I said, we invested a lot of effort, and it's really important to have your feedback. You mentioned the general population surveys that include the EMM population one. And that's very interesting because we really made an effort not to concentrate only on surveys that were addressed exclusively to this population, but also, and that was a really big decision to make because it implied more work, but to include general population surveys in that registry. And it pays off, according to what you said, is the way to go, so it's very rewarding for us to go in that direction, and also to go in the direction that you both mentioned, and also Thomas, including soft measures, because as where surveys in the future won't be replaceable by any other tool, and that's important for us as well. I mean, you can have administrative records and facilitate survey data collection by having access to administrative data, but you won't be able to replace measures aiming at gathering all perceptions, motivations, and that has to be analyzed together. So it's really, really interesting what you said. And now I think we can open the floor to comments and questions, not only addressed to you and to the topics you addressed, but also the previous presentations. So there was already one over there. Do you need a mic or maybe?
Yeah, but if I don't know if there's anybody that wants to ask or...
Well,
this,
I mean,
maybe
we're going to gather questions. Sorry, I should do it because it's 12 is addressed to Amy.
Yeah, my questions are addressed to Ali. Well, questions and suggestions. Well, it's pretty impressive. I disagree with you that the back end doesn't look that good. It looks really good. Yeah, from my experience on this, yeah, it looks a lot of work that has been put into this. I just have a few suggestions for you to consider. One would be useful, apart from human-based interaction to input data, that it can be automatized. So if you can export, import the profiles of the surveys, so the API, or I mean, you don't need to do that, no? But since I understand that you have already used the DPI as a standard, probably, I think this is a clear, immediate, low-hanging fruit that would enhance a lot the value of this. Both sides, importing and exporting the data. Second, since also you have the functionality of managing the database, sorry, the variables, you call them, I would suggest that you consider also versioning. So creating versions of the metadata that you have. And also one of the points for the website, you suggest also, that's a side comment, you suggest that there is a suggestion to quote the register, the EMM registry whenever it's used. It would be good also if you suggest how to quote it. Yeah, and then find mid-term and long-term wise, what will happen definitely with so many surveys in is that the contact people that is provided there, maybe sometimes somebody will try to reach them and they will not be reachable. So it would be also good to foresee this, and even though it's relevant to have this information that one survey once upon a time was done with all these characteristics, it would be good that the user knows that this is not reachable. So you don't invest the time, but also, or maybe you invest time rightly from the very beginning. And then finally, and maybe relate also to the question, to the suggestions that Laura posted yesterday on from where to go from now on. Definitely it would be really valuable for a global organizations. Talking now from UNICEF point of view, I'm convinced that ION and UNHCR will also jump into it. It would be really good to consider expanding this register, so other countries can benefit from inputting the service, and anybody else can also access to this information. And I will be glad to discuss about this and potential collaboration if you want to look forward.
So since I'm here, okay, great.
Camille Doyen from Flanders. We did a very large survey living together in diversity, so it would be interesting. I don't think it's already in it because it would be our team that put it in and we haven't done it yet. So a very practical question. time investment approximately? Is it a question of hours, of days, of weeks to put it in? And then our survey was translated into seven languages, but not in English. So all the questions, it's very sensitive. If we change the language, then it's not the same sensitivity, or you have to be very careful in translating. So if I would just approximately translate the question that we asked into English, it wouldn't be correct. So how is it done? Do I put in the questions in Flemish or French or whatever? How does it work?
Maybe you can answer.
Quickly, so thank you, all of you, for your very helpful feedback in terms of both the front and back end. A quick comment about Aliyyah, for your very rigorous kind of testing of the registry. So the difference between Muslim and Muslims, that was a mistake on our end in terms of standardization. So I've just made a note myself to be a bit more vigilant about checking those variables. So this is the quality control process. It's a collective effort where it is centralized at Sciences Po, but we do leverage different RAs that are not necessarily based in Paris. Also STSNs, which are these short-term scientific missions that are part of the cost action funding. So there's a lot of different people who are kind of contributing and helping with the quality control. So that's why there may have been some misalignment with how the standardization happened, but it's a really great point and something that we should be vigilant about, because as we add in more surveys, it's important that we are consistent with how we standardize these types of variables. The nice thing is the registry is set up where I can make those fixes, so I've just removed and modified those differences, so now we don't have this difference between Muslims and Muslims anymore. All of the surveys are now tagged consistently. We had a question about versioning of the metadata variables. That's a really good point. I think we had received feedback about that as well, but we actually haven't discussed this in detail with Young Minds, the IT company. So I've made a note to have a conversation with them about how we can keep track of that information, so it's not manual where we have like an Excel spreadsheet that we're keeping track of those changes, because right now the way it's set up, it doesn't necessarily capture the whole history of the version. In terms of documenting situations where the data producer or the distributor or owner is no longer reachable, some of the countries have done a really great job of leveraging the comment section for our the form to indicate when that might be the case. So they might say, here, this is the actual name of the survey producer, but here in the comment section, I just noted that this institution no longer exists, so in that situation, you can contact me, the individual who filled out the template, for example. Trying to think. Oh, the API. So that's something that we have actually engaged Young Minds to develop for us. This is something that we have not progressed as much yet, but the idea is to have the API that produces DDI compliant XML files on the front end. It should be set up in a way where you can pull that information directly by clicking on a very clearly marked link. But that's something that we unfortunately are not able to show today because it's not quite at a stage where it's usable, but it's something that we know that is necessary in order to make our registry fair compliant. Hopefully I addressed everything.
And question about the question about
okay.
planners.
So is this in regards to how you would fill out the create survey form? Okay. So for that, we are asking everyone to fill it out in English. So there would be some translation on, I guess, your end in order to make sure that you're capturing the information onto the form. Trying to think. Oh.
Yeah, but you
So in reality, at this stage, we're not asking people to translate questionnaires at all. So I think your main concern would be about the content of the questionnaire. And this is not something we're doing at this stage. This is something we will start to be doing when we develop more the question data bank. But what we've shown today, which is the survey registry, here we're only asking about information about the technical details about the survey. So you will not be having to translate questions of the questionnaire at all. You would only have to tick boxes about what topics those questions are covering. So translation would not be an issue in relation to what you would have to do to fill in the metadata variables of the registry that I've showcased today. In terms of the estimate of how long it would take you to fill all that form that Ami has shown so that it will be shown, your surveys can be shown in the registry, our current estimation is that if you have all of the pieces of information with you at hand, it would take you around 5-6 hours, so one full day of work of someone who is really knowledgeable about the survey. They should be done in one full working day. If the person is not someone fully knowledgeable about the survey, it can take several days of part-time work because they would have to actually then gather the pieces of information. So it really depends on who is actually filling in the survey. If the person who's filling in the survey knows the survey very well and has all the information at hand, at most one full day of work. That's our estimation.
I can add one more thing about the Create Survey form. I think I can speak loud enough for everyone to hear. We do want to test that feature more rigorously while it's in this testing phase. First, we'll do it internally by leveraging the RAs and SDFs that we have. But if there are people who are producing surveys and they have a record that they're willing to put up, I'm happy to connect with you and I can set you up with an account so that you as an external individual can test from a very new perspective how this form functions without having been very involved with this cost action already. And we'd be very happy to get that feedback because, like I said, at the end of the day, the form needs to be usable for us as a cost action, but also to any other person who might stumble upon the registry and want to leverage it and contribute to it in the future. In terms of timeline, maybe by the end of this month we would be able to connect, but again, if we can exchange contact information, I can keep you posted in terms of when we'll be ready to do that kind of testing with external individuals.
Okay. More comments, questions, suggestions? Yeah, then we can maybe discuss all of this.
Sorry to take the floor again. No, just these questions reminds me of an important limitation of many of those surveys is in which language it is asked, well, those that are specific to immigrants or minorities. And to come back to the EU level 4 survey, we know that there are different practices across countries, and that those member states that do make the effort to translate the survey in other languages than their main languages have higher response rate or less problems in terms of sample size or representativeness. I don't know to what extent, based on all the surveys you looked at, you could also draw some kind of lessons or best practices, or just to know where it's the case or not. I guess not in terms of the cost, how much it costs in the overall cost of the survey, but at least to perhaps also push for some change in this area. Just to mention also, in 2017 we had this Eurobarometer on integration. That was where we tried to use existing surveys, check where we could kind of best questions. Sometimes you have very good questions on topics that are not the priorities and vice versa. But okay, this was a typical example of a quick and dirty process. As you mentioned, well, you did not mention that, but yeah. We intend to repeat such specific Eurobarometer on integration in the future. We don't know yet whether it will be kind of quantitative survey or whether we will move back to a qualitative as we had back in 2011. But just to say, we hope that we'll be able also to build on what is there, because it's really about surveying the whole population. I mean, not only natives, but because migrants will be part of the sample size, but of the sample. but we hope that in this new Eurobarometer we can benefit from the project, and in case there are some key lessons that are also taken from the project, we'd be happy to benefit from it.
Very good to react to that. Yes, so in relation to this last point about the languages, actually the survey registry for every single survey tells you in which languages the questionnaires were fielded. So we do have for every single survey that it's there, whether it was the questionnaire was actually produced only in one language, or whether it was translated to several languages, and then in which languages it was translated. So we can, in a second, what we're going to be working also from March onwards will be on the analysis of the metadata. We will be producing reports with statistical analysis about the metadata. So we can clearly do a correlation analysis to see if a greater translation in terms of the languages used for the questionnaires correlates with higher response rates, where the information about response rates is available, which is not always the case. But we can certainly look at that.